Today's story is about a family in West Virginia who, on Christmas Eve of 1945, went to bed in a happy home with 10 children under their roof, and who woke up a few hours later to find their house on fire and 5 of their kids missing. And when the fire was finally put out, and investigators started sifting through the ashes to try to find the children's remains, they found something so strange that it launched what is basically the longest, most obsessive, and most heartbreaking private investigation in the history of American cold cases. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. At around 1 in the morning on Christmas morning, December 25th, 1945, in a 2-story wooden farmhouse on a hillside outside of a small town in West Virginia, a middle-aged woman named Jenny was asleep in her downstairs bedroom when she was suddenly woken up by the sound of the telephone ringing. Jenny got out of bed, walked into the hallway, and picked up the phone. On the other end of the line was a woman that Jenny did not recognize, who asked to speak to somebody Jenny had also never heard of. Jenny told the woman she had the wrong number, but the woman on the other end just kind of laughed in this strange, mocking way and then hung up. Jenny stood there in the hallway for a second, holding the phone, kind of confused. Then, because she was already up, she started walking around the ground floor of the house to check on things before going back to bed. She noticed that the front door was unlocked, which was strange, because her husband George always locked the front door before bed. She also noticed that some of the Christmas curtains her kids had put up earlier that evening were still down and had not been drawn shut for the night. So Jenny went around, locking the doors and closing the curtains. Then she went back to her bedroom and got back into bed. And at some point over the next hour, she heard a soft thump on the roof of the house, kind of like a small object had landed up there and rolled down. But she was tired, so she did not think much of it, and she went back to sleep. Then, at around 1:30 in the morning, Jenny was woken up again. But this time, it was not by a phone call. It was by the smell of smoke. And within a few seconds, her whole house was on fire. Jenny ran into the hallway screaming for her husband and her children, because Jenny was not the only person in this house. Jenny and her husband George had 10 children, and 9 of those children were sleeping upstairs in the house that night. Their oldest son, John, who was 23, was also sleeping upstairs. And within about a minute of Jenny waking up, most of the family had made it downstairs and out the front door and onto the lawn. But when everyone got out and they took a count of who was there and who was not there, they realized that 5 of the children were missing. Their names were Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, Jenny Irene, who was 8, and Betty, who was 5. All 5 of them were still inside the burning house. And George Sauter, their father, did everything a father could do. He ran back to the house. He tried to get in through the front door, but the flames were already too intense. So he ran around to the side of the house and tried to climb up to the second-floor window where the children slept. But when he reached for the ladder that he always kept propped against the side of the house, the ladder was not there. It was gone. So George ran to his 2 coal delivery trucks, which he used for his job, and he tried to start them so he could drive one of them up to the house and climb onto the roof from the truck bed. But neither one of the trucks would start. Both engines were completely dead, which was strange because George drove those trucks every day, and they had both been running perfectly fine that afternoon. So Jenny ran to a neighbor's house to try to call the fire department. But when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The phone was dead. Jenny ran to a different neighbor's house. That phone was dead too. Then it took over an hour for anybody to actually reach the local fire department because the operators were not answering the emergency line. And even after the fire department was finally reached, they did not show up at the Sauter house until 8 in the morning, which was almost 7 hours after the fire had started. By that point, the entire wooden farmhouse had burned to the ground. There was basically nothing left. But Jenny and George had already accepted in their minds that their 5 children were dead because there was no way they could have survived the fire. So when the fire department finally got there and they walked through the ashes with the family, everybody was expecting to find at least some remains, some bones, some teeth, something to say goodbye to. They did not find anything. The entire burn site was searched, from the ashes on the ground level down through the basement and out into the yard. And in a fire hot enough to reduce a wooden two-story house to a foundation-level pile of ashes in less than 45 minutes, some remains of 5 children should have been recoverable. But the searchers found no bones, no teeth, no pieces of skulls, no fragments of femurs, nothing. The West Virginia State Fire Marshal at the time officially ruled the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring and that the 5 Sodder children had been completely cremated by the heat of the fire. And the case was closed. But George and Jenny Sodder never believed it. And over the next 44 years, until Jenny's death in 1989, they conducted their own private investigation, out of their own pocket, to what they came to believe was one of the strangest and most disturbing kidnappings in American history. Here is what George and Jenny kept coming back to. Point number 1. That mysterious phone call Jenny had gotten in the middle of the night from a woman she did not recognize, asking for a name she did not know. Who was that? And why did she call? Point number 2. Somebody had unlocked their front door before the fire started. Point number 3. George's ladder, which he always kept in the same spot against the side of the house, had been moved. Investigators later found it about 75 feet away from the house, at the bottom of a nearby hill, like somebody had deliberately taken it and dumped it there before the fire. Point number 4. Both of George's coal trucks had been sabotaged. The mechanic who examined them later concluded that somebody had messed with the engines specifically so they could not be used the night of the fire. Point number 5. The phone lines to the house and to 2 of the neighbors' houses had all been cut, not damaged by the fire. Actually cut with something like wire cutters at a spot about 14 feet up on a telephone pole outside. Point number 6. A bus driver who happened to be passing the house at the time of the fire later told George and Jenny that he had seen someone throwing something onto the roof of the house from the road. He had assumed it was maybe a firework or something. But this was hours after Jenny had heard the soft thump on the roof. Point number 7. Christmas presents that had been placed under the family's Christmas tree just hours before the fire, made of paper and cardboard, which should have burned to ash in the fire, were later found intact in the ashes. And point number 8. The fire, which had reached temperatures capable of allegedly incinerating 5 children beyond recognition, had not been hot enough to melt the household appliances in the kitchen. The refrigerator, the stove, and other metal items were still identifiable after the fire, which meant to George and Jenny Sodder that the fire had almost certainly not gotten hot enough to completely cremate 5 children, which meant in their minds that their 5 children had not actually died in the fire, and that whoever had orchestrated the cut phone lines and the sabotaged trucks and the moved ladder and the mocking phone call had actually taken their children. And over the next several decades, George and Jenny basically dedicated the rest of their lives to trying to find them. They hired multiple private investigators. They took out full-page advertisements in newspapers across the United States, offering a reward for any information. They corresponded with law enforcement agencies in dozens of states. They chased leads all the way to South America. And in 1952, 7 years after the fire, George and Jenny put up a giant billboard on the side of Route 16, right outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia, that featured photos of their 5 missing children. And that billboard stayed up for almost 40 years. And they got tips, so many tips. A woman told them she had seen 5 children being taken through a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, on Christmas morning 1945. A tourist told them she had seen 4 of the 5 kids at a house in Cuba years later. A traveling salesman said he had recognized Martha at an orphanage in a small town. But the most disturbing tip of all came in 1968, because in that year, exactly 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder went out to her mailbox one morning and found an envelope waiting for her. The envelope had a Kentucky postmark, but no return address. And when Jenny opened it up, she pulled out a black and white photograph of a young man, probably in his 20s, staring straight into the camera. And Jenny looked at his eyes, and she looked at his nose, and she looked at the shape of his face. And she was convinced that she was looking at a photograph of her son, Louis, all grown up. On the back of the photograph, in messy handwriting, was a note. It read, quote, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys, A90132 or 35, end quote." And that was it. There was no explanation. There was no address to write back to. There was nothing. George and Jenny hired a private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to try to trace the photograph. The investigator never came back with any information, and the sender of the photograph was never identified. George Sauter died in 1968, just a few months after that photograph arrived. Jenny kept the investigation going alone for another 20 years until her death in 1989. When Jenny died, her surviving children took down the billboard on Route 16. Today, over 78 years after the fire, all of Jenny and George's surviving children who lived through that Christmas Eve and who had spent their whole lives trying to find their missing brothers and sisters have also passed away. The last one, Sylvia Sauter Paxton, who was 2 years old on the night of the fire and had survived, died in 2021. None of them ever found out what happened to Maurice, or Martha, or Louis, or Jenny Irene, or Betty. And to this day, no one has ever been able to fully explain the phone call, the cut wires, the sabotaged trucks, the moved ladder, or the photograph from Kentucky. And the Sauter children remain, officially, 5 of the most haunting missing persons cases in the entire history of the United States. And somewhere out there, in a filing cabinet or an attic in West Virginia, there is a black and white photograph of a young man who may or may not have been Louis Sauter, staring quietly out at the family that spent their entire lives looking for him. The man who fell into the storm today's story is about a man who, on the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, walked onto a commercial airplane in Oregon, hijacked it with a bomb, demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, and then, before the plane could land, opened the back door in midair and jumped out into a thunderstorm. He was never found. And to this day, over 50 years later, his real identity is still one of the most obsessed over mysteries in the history of the FBI. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. At around 2:50 in the afternoon on Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, at Portland International Airport in Oregon, a man in his mid-40s walked up to the ticket counter of an airline called Northwest Orient. He was wearing a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and shiny black leather shoes. He was carrying a briefcase. He looked like basically every other businessman in the terminal that day. The man handed the ticket agent a $20 bill and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. When the ticket agent asked him his name, the man said, quote, Dan Cooper. And the ticket agent typed the name Dan Cooper into her system, printed him a boarding pass for a flight called Northwest Orient Flight 305, and handed it to him. And Dan Cooper walked away. An hour later, Dan Cooper boarded that flight. He was assigned to seat 18C at the back of the plane on the aisle. The plane was a Boeing 727-100, and it had 36 other passengers on board that afternoon. Cooper sat down in his seat, put his briefcase on his lap, and lit a cigarette. When the flight attendant, a young woman named Florence Schaffner, walked past him, Cooper ordered a bourbon and 7-Up. Florence brought him the drink. Cooper paid her with cash. And then, once the plane had taken off and was in the air, Cooper called Florence back to his row, and he handed her a folded piece of paper. Florence looked at the paper, and she assumed it was a phone number, because a lot of male passengers on that route used to try to slip her their phone numbers. So she basically just kind of thanked him, and she went to put the paper in her pocket without reading it. But Cooper leaned toward her, and he said, quote, Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb. Florence very quietly opened up the piece of paper. And what she read on that paper was neat capital letter handwriting that said, quote, I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit next to me. Florence sat down next to Cooper, who then opened up his briefcase, just enough for her to see inside of it. And Florence would later describe what she saw as being what appeared to be several red cylinders wired together, connected to a battery. It looked, at least to her eyes, like a real bomb. Cooper closed the briefcase, and then very calmly, he gave Florence his list of demands. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, delivered to him in a knapsack. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 front and 2 back. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by at the Seattle airport to refuel the plane the moment they landed. If any of his demands were not met, he told her, he was going to blow up the entire plane. Florence walked, as calmly as she could, up to the front of the aircraft, and she gave the note to the pilot, a captain named William Scott. Captain Scott immediately radioed Seattle Air Traffic Control, and Seattle Air Traffic Control immediately relayed the message to the FBI. And for the next 2 hours, as the plane circled over Seattle waiting to land, Northwest Orient and the FBI and the president of the airline, whose name was Donald Nyrop, worked to get Cooper what he was asking for. The plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at around 5:39 p.m. Cooper's demands were met in full. The $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of about $1.5 million today, was loaded onto the plane inside a canvas knapsack. 4 parachutes were delivered, and a fuel truck rolled up to refuel the plane. In exchange, Cooper released all 36 of the other passengers, along with Florence Schaffner and the other main flight attendant. He kept the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and one flight attendant named Tina Mucklow on board with him. Then Cooper gave the pilots a new set of instructions. He told them to fly the plane to Mexico City, but he wanted them to fly it at a very specific low altitude, at a very specific slow speed, with the landing gear down and with the wing flaps at a specific angle. And he wanted them to leave the rear stairs of the plane, which on a Boeing 727 could actually be lowered while the plane was flying, unlocked. The pilots, along with the FBI and Northwest Orient, all realized what Cooper was planning to do. Cooper was going to jump out of the plane. The plane took off from Seattle at 7:40 p.m. And once it was in the air, Cooper ordered the flight attendant Tina Mucklow to go into the front of the plane with the pilots and to shut the curtain that separated first class from the rear of the plane. So Tina walked to the front and she pulled the curtain shut, and Cooper was alone in the back of the plane with the money. Then, at approximately 8:00 p.m., one of the crew members inside the cockpit noticed a small light flash on the instrument panel, indicating that somebody in the back of the plane had just opened the rear stairs. A few minutes later, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the pilots felt the plane suddenly bob upward, which was consistent with a sudden change in weight distribution, consistent with somebody having just jumped off of the rear stairs. The plane continued on to Reno, Nevada, where it landed at about 10:15 p.m. And when FBI agents boarded the plane after it landed, they found the rear stairs down. They found Cooper's black tie sitting on his seat, and they found no sign of Cooper or of the $200,000 or of 2 of the 4 parachutes he had asked for. Cooper had jumped. He had jumped somewhere out over the mountains and forests of southwestern Washington state, in the pitch dark, into a thunderstorm, and nobody ever saw him again. Now, the moment Cooper disappeared into the sky, one of the largest, most obsessive, and most detailed manhunts in the entire history of the FBI began. Because the FBI knew, based on the flight path of the plane, roughly where Cooper had jumped from. He had jumped from a stretch of airspace over an area of southwestern Washington called the Cascade Mountains. So the FBI mobilized hundreds of agents, along with local law enforcement, along with the United States military, and they started combing the forests of southwestern Washington on foot, on horseback, and by helicopter, looking for Cooper's body, or his parachute, or any of the $200,000 and $20 bills. The FBI knew exactly which bills were in the ransom, because the numbers on all 10,000 of the $20 bills had been recorded before the money was handed over to Cooper. And that meant if any of those bills ever showed up in circulation anywhere in the United States, the FBI would know instantly. So the FBI notified every bank, every store, every casino, every place that handled cash across the entire country. They released the serial numbers to the public. They basically told the whole country, if you ever get a $20 bill and the serial number matches this list, that money came from the D.B. Cooper hijacking. And for 9 years, not a single one of those $20 bills showed up anywhere. Then, in February of 1980, a family was having a picnic on the banks of the Columbia River in a spot called Tena Bar in Washington State, about 20 miles from where the plane had been at the time of the jump. And a little boy who was 8 years old, whose name was Brian Ingram, was digging around in the sand at the edge of the river. And he pulled up 3 bundles of $20 bills. The bills were rotten. They were falling apart. They were still bundled together with rubber bands that had partially deteriorated. And when investigators tested the serial numbers on the bills, they came back as a match. It was $5,880 of the ransom money from the D.B. Cooper hijacking, but it was the only money that ever turned up. Not another single bill from the ransom has ever been found anywhere in the world. And Cooper himself was, at this point, part of American folk legend, because the mystery of who he actually was and whether he had survived the jump had captivated the country. There had been songs written about him, there had been movies made about him, there had been documentaries, there had been TV specials, and basically every couple of years, somebody new would come forward claiming to be the real D.B. Cooper, or claiming that their father or their uncle or their neighbor had confessed on their deathbed to being the real D.B. Cooper. The FBI, over the years, seriously investigated dozens of suspects. There was a paratrooper from Michigan named Kenneth Christensen, whose brother went on record after his death saying he was sure Kenneth had done it. There was a Vietnam War veteran named Robert Rackstraw, who had a criminal record and matched Cooper's physical description. There was even a theory, taken seriously by some investigators, that Cooper had actually been a transgender woman named Barbara Dayton, who had been a licensed pilot and a librarian in the Pacific Northwest, and who was reported to have confessed to friends before her death that she had been Cooper. But none of these suspects was ever definitively identified as the real D.B. Cooper. Then, in July of 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI officially closed the case. They announced that they were going to redirect their resources to other cases, and that if any new evidence ever turned up, they would consider reopening it. But as of right now, it is officially unsolved. And the identity of the man who called himself Dan Cooper and who politely ordered a bourbon and 7-Up before hijacking a passenger jet, and who then quietly jumped out of the back of that jet into a thunderstorm over the Cascade Mountains with $200,000 strapped to his body, is still unknown. There are basically only two ways that story could have ended. Either Cooper landed in the wilderness, injured himself, or drowned in a river, or died of hypothermia, and his body, along with the vast majority of the money, is still out there somewhere in the mountains of Washington state, buried under 50 years of leaves and dirt. Or Cooper, somehow, against every possible odd, actually survived the jump, walked out of the forest, and spent the rest of his life as an ordinary person somewhere in America, quietly holding on to the biggest and most successful hijacking secret of the 20th century. And the fact that in over 5 decades, not a single one of the $20 bills he had strapped to his body has been used in a single legitimate transaction anywhere in the United States suggests that whichever one of those two things actually happened, Cooper took the truth of it with him. The call that ended in the ditch today's story is about a 19-year-old college student in Minnesota who, on a spring night in 2008, ran his car into a ditch on a rural country road and then called his parents to come pick him up. And what happened between that phone call and the moment his parents actually got to the ditch is a mystery that has haunted his family and Minnesota law enforcement for over 17 years. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. At around 1 in the morning on Wednesday, May 14th, 2008, a small farming town called Marshall, Minnesota, a middle-aged woman named Annette was asleep in bed next to her husband Brian when her cell phone on the nightstand started ringing. Annette rolled over, kind of half asleep, grabbed the phone, and looked at the screen. The name on the screen was her 19-year-old son. So she picked up, and the second she said hello, her son started talking really fast on the other end of the line. He was clearly upset. He said he had been driving home from a party a couple of hours earlier, and at some point he had taken a wrong turn on the country roads, and now he was completely lost. He had ended up on some kind of dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and a few minutes ago, he had accidentally driven his car straight into a deep ditch. The car was stuck. He could not get it out. And he needed his mom and dad to come pick him up. So Annette got out of bed, and she woke Brian up, and the two of them threw on jackets, got in their own car, and started driving. And Annette stayed on the phone with her son the entire time, because she wanted him to describe what he was seeing around him, so she and Brian could figure out where he was. But her son could not really tell them exactly where he was, because it was pitch dark, and there were no road signs anywhere near him, and all he could see was empty fields on both sides. So Annette said, "Okay, just start walking. Walk in whatever direction feels right. Tell us what you see. We are coming." Now, the area that their son was somewhere lost inside of is a stretch of rural southwestern Minnesota that is basically nothing but farmland for miles and miles. It is dead flat. It is crisscrossed by these narrow, unmarked gravel roads that connect the farms. And at night, once you get more than a few miles away from any of the small towns, it is just completely, totally dark. The kind of dark where you cannot really see your own hand in front of your face if you are not near a light source. So their son, on his side of the phone call, was basically stumbling along a dirt road in the middle of a pitch-black field, trying to describe landmarks that he could not really see, while his mom and dad drove around trying to find him. And this phone call went on for 47 minutes. For 47 straight minutes, Annette stayed on the phone with her son. He told her he could see what he thought were the lights of a town far off in the distance. He said he was walking toward those lights. He told her about the sounds he was hearing around him. He mentioned hearing what he thought were animals. He mentioned that he could hear a river or a stream somewhere. And Annette and Brian kept driving, calling out to him through the phone, telling him to keep talking, telling him they were almost there. Then, at 47 minutes and 46 seconds into the phone call, their son suddenly said, quote, "Oh shit," and the line went dead. Annette immediately called him back. It rang. He did not pick up. She called him again and again, but nobody was answering. And by this point, she and Brian had been driving around these rural roads for close to an hour, and they had not found him, and now they could not get him back on the phone. And Annette basically knew in her gut that something had just happened to her son. That 19-year-old college student standing in the dark on a rural dirt road in southwestern Minnesota at 1:56 in the morning, whose parents were desperately trying to reach him, whose last two words to his mother were, "Oh shit," has never been seen or heard from again. His name was Brandon Swanson. And in the 17 years since that phone call, despite one of the largest missing persons searches in the history of the state of Minnesota, no one has ever found a single trace of him. Brandon Victor Swanson was born in January of 1989. He grew up in that same town of Marshall, Minnesota, with his parents Brian and Annette and his younger sister Jamin. He was, by all accounts, a really likable kid. He was in the band in high school. He was in ROTC. He worked part-time jobs at a couple of local businesses. And after he graduated from high school, he had gone off to college at a school called Minnesota West Community and Technical College in a town called Canby, which was about 45 miles northwest of Marshall. Brandon was studying to become a truck driver. And the night that Brandon disappeared, on May 13th, 2008, he had just finished up his last exam of the semester. He was done with school for the summer. So Brandon and a bunch of his friends had gotten together to celebrate, and they had gone to a couple of parties in the Canby area. Brandon had a few drinks, but by all accounts, he was not really that drunk. Sometime around midnight, Brandon got in his car, which was a green 1994 Chevy Lumina, and he started making the drive from Canby back to his parents' house in Marshall. But then Brandon took a wrong turn somewhere, and instead of ending up on the main highway that would have taken him straight to Marshall, he ended up on one of those narrow, unmarked rural farm roads. And in the pitch dark, he lost his sense of direction. And at some point after 1 in the morning, his car left the road and got stuck in a ditch, which is when Brandon had called his mom. Now here's where the mystery of Brandon Swanson gets even more disturbing. Because when Annette and Brian could not reach Brandon after the line went dead, they immediately drove home and they called the Minnesota State Patrol and they reported him missing. And the Minnesota State Patrol basically told them, look, your son is a 19-year-old college kid who was out partying and got lost driving home. He probably fell asleep somewhere, or his phone died, or he is embarrassed and does not want to call his parents. Give it a few hours. He will turn up. But Brandon did not turn up. So the next day, Annette and Brian and their friends started organizing their own search parties, and they started driving around the rural county roads looking for Brandon's green Chevy Lumina. And after several hours of searching, one of the search parties found the car. It was in a ditch, exactly like Brandon had described, in a really remote area near a tiny town called Porter, which was about 25 miles north of where Brandon actually thought he had been. Meaning Brandon had been much, much more lost than even he had realized. The car was intact. Brandon's belongings were still inside. But Brandon was nowhere near it. and there was no trail of footprints leading away from the car in any obvious direction. The ground around the ditch was pretty hard, and there had been some light rain that night, and so any tracks Brandon might have left were basically not visible. But something Brandon had told his mother during the phone call was strange, because at one point during the call, Brandon had told Annette that he could see the lights of the town of Lind, which was one of the small towns closer to their home in Marshall. He had said he was walking toward those lights, but when his car was found, it was near Porter, and Porter is nowhere near Lind. In fact, Porter is on the exact opposite side of Marshall from Lind, which means the lights Brandon had told his mother he was walking toward that night, the lights he thought were Lind, were actually the lights of a completely different town. And whatever direction Brandon had been walking in, based on his phone call, was almost certainly a wrong direction. Then the search really started, because once the Swanson family knew where Brandon's car had been found, they started searching that entire area on foot. They organized hundreds of volunteers. Local farmers volunteered their tractors and their equipment. The Yellow Medicine County Sheriff's Office got involved. Search dogs were brought in. Aircraft with thermal imaging equipment did flyovers. Divers were sent into every single body of water in the region, including the Yellow Medicine River, which runs through the area. Every abandoned farm building, every silo, every barn, every drainage tunnel was searched. And the search continued, off and on, for the next several years. But investigators found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace of Brandon Swanson. Over the years, several theories have been proposed about what happened to Brandon in the last few seconds of that phone call. The most widely accepted theory, and the one that Brandon's own family has often said they think is the most likely, is that when Brandon said, "Oh shit," and the line went dead, what had actually happened was that he had walked in the pitch dark right off the edge of a steep bank into a river or a creek and had drowned. Because the phone records showed that at the moment the call ended, Brandon had been very close to a stretch of the Yellow Medicine River, and a body pulled downstream by a rural river, especially in a remote farming area, could easily go undiscovered for decades. But there are other theories too. There is a theory that Brandon may have been attacked by wild animals, because the area does have coyotes, and there had been reports of aggressive coyotes in the region around that time. There is a theory that Brandon may have wandered into a farm and gotten caught in some kind of agricultural equipment, like a manure pit, which are known to be extremely dangerous and can trap a person almost instantly. And there is even a much darker theory, which some investigators have quietly discussed over the years, that Brandon may have crossed paths with somebody out on those rural roads that night, and that somebody may have made sure he was never seen again, but none of these theories has ever been proven. And to this day, nobody knows what Brandon Swanson said "oh shit" at. Brandon's disappearance actually led to a change in Minnesota state law, and eventually to a change in laws in several other states as well. Because at the time Annette and Brian first tried to report Brandon missing, the Minnesota State Patrol had essentially told them that because Brandon was a 19-year-old adult, they did not have to file an official missing persons report right away. Adults are allowed to disappear if they want to. In 2009, 1 year after Brandon vanished, the Minnesota State Legislature passed a new law called Brandon's Law, which requires law enforcement agencies to immediately open an investigation and begin a search when a missing person is reported, regardless of the person's age. That law has since been credited with helping locate hundreds of missing people across the country, but it did not help find Brandon. And so today, in that same house in Marshall, Minnesota, Brandon Swanson's parents, Annette and Brian, who are now in their 60s, still keep his bedroom exactly the way it was on the night of May 13th, 2008. His clothes are still in his closet. His trophies are still on his shelf. His pictures are still on the wall. And every single time Annette hears about a set of unidentified human remains being found somewhere in the Midwest, she calls the county coroner and asks if the remains could possibly be her son. Because after 17 years, she still is not ready to give up on the possibility that Brandon might come home. Or, at the very least, that she might finally find out what he was walking toward on that dark country road in southwestern Minnesota in the last 47 minutes of his life. Because whatever happened at 1:56 in the morning on May 14th, 2008, when a 19-year-old kid on a phone call with his mom suddenly said, "Oh shit," and the line went dead, is still, to this day, the darkest and most complete disappearance in the recent history of the state of Minnesota. And it is a mystery that, according to the search commander who worked the original case, is probably never going to be solved. The killer who left everything behind, imagine a killer who left almost everything behind. His clothes, his blood, his fingerprints, his DNA, even his own bag, packed with sand from 2 different continents. He left behind an entire life's worth of evidence scattered across a single crime scene, over 12,000 individual pieces of it, and police still could not find him. A quarter of a century later, this case remains one of the most thoroughly documented murders in the world, and also one of the most unsolved. Not because there wasn't enough evidence, because somehow there was almost too much of it. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. It's a little after 11 at night on December 30th, the year 2000. In a quiet corner of Tokyo called Kamisoshigaya, most of the streetlights along this stretch are dark, because most of the houses on this side of the block don't have anyone living in them anymore. The city has spent years quietly buying up land here, one lot at a time, to expand the park next door, and one by one the neighbors have taken the offer and moved on. Only a handful of homes remain standing, and in one of them, a family of 4 is spending one of the last ordinary evenings of the year, warm light spilling through the curtains onto a lawn gone cold with December frost. Earlier that night, the 8-year-old daughter had walked next door to see her grandmother, the way she often did, since the 2 houses stood close enough to practically share a driveway. Now she's home. The rest of the family is settling in for the night, in a house that backs right up against the park, close enough to hear the wind move through the trees at the edge of the property. At the back of the house, on the 2nd floor, there's a bathroom window. And sometime after 11, that window is open, when it shouldn't be. Somebody has climbed up to it. Whoever it is thin, not especially tall, dressed for the cold, with a bag slung across his body. A bag that, if anyone could see inside it, is carrying sand. Real sand, the kind you'd find on a military installation on the other side of the world, and also the kind you'd find on a skate park a few miles from where he's standing right now. 2 places have left their fingerprint on that one bag, and neither of them explains what he's doing outside a family home in Setagaya at 11 o'clock at night. He pulls the screen loose. It falls to the ground below, into the mud, where his footprints are already sinking in. And then he climbs through. Somewhere between 11:30 and just after midnight, that window closes again. And when it does, everything about this house, and everyone inside it, is about to change. But here's the strange part. The person who came through it isn't in any hurry to leave. He's going to stay for hours. The next morning is December 31st, the last day of the year, and nobody in the little house next door has answered the phone. Not for a morning call, not for the calls that come after. So a little before 11, the grandmother next door decides to walk over herself, the way you do when a family goes quiet and you'd rather feel foolish than worried. The front door is open, not forced, not broken. Just open the way a door is when the person who used it last simply didn't think to close it behind them. And that's when everything changes, because what she finds inside that house is going to bring officers from precincts across Tokyo, then investigators from the National Police Agency, and eventually more than 200,000 officers over the years that follow. And not one of them will ever be able to tell her who was still inside her daughter's house long after it went quiet, because the family she finds is her own daughter's family. 4 people who had lived in that house since 1991. Her daughter's name was Yasuko Miyazawa, 41 years old. Her son-in-law was Mikio, 44. And in the rooms upstairs, the 2 children, Nina, 8, and Ray, just 6. The same little boy who'd been home for the night in a house that was never going to be safe again after 11 o'clock came and went. Mikio and Yasuko had built an ordinary, quiet life in Kamisoshigaya. Mikio worked the long, steady hours of a Tokyo salaryman, commuting into the city and coming home to the house he and his family had lived in since the start of the decade. Yasuko stayed closer to home, tutoring neighborhood children in a house that used to belong to her side of the family. The walk so short it barely counted as leaving her own front yard. For most of the 90s, this stretch of Kamisoshigaya had been a real neighborhood, full and lived in, pressed right up against what would become Soshigaya Park. But as the years went on, the city began quietly buying up the land around them, house by house, and one by one the neighbors took the money and left. By the time 2000 arrived, only a small handful of homes were still standing on that street, the Miyazawa house among them, along with the one next door, where Yasuko's mother lived, close enough that visitors sometimes mistook the two buildings for a single home split in half. The emptying neighborhood brought its own small tensions. With fewer families around, the land near the park had become popular with local skateboarders, and Mikio, like a few of his remaining neighbors, wasn't thrilled about the noise drifting over at odd hours. It was the most mundane kind of irritation, the sort of thing you complain about once and then let go. Nothing about it suggested danger. If anything, it was the least remarkable detail in an otherwise unremarkable life. By December, the family had already made peace with leaving. The plan, like almost everyone else on the block, was to sell and move on in the new year. Nina was 8, still young enough to visit her grandmother most evenings without being asked twice. Ray was 6, and on the night of December 30th, none of that had changed yet. By every account anyone has ever been able to piece together, it was an entirely normal night, in an entirely normal house, right up until it wasn't. But that house wasn't as unwatched as it looked. In the days before the murders, more than one neighbor would later recall a man who didn't belong on that quiet street. Someone in his mid-40s checking out the property 3 days before. And the afternoon before the murders, a woman near the train station a mile and a half away noticed a young man in thin clothes, far too light for a Tokyo December, wearing a bag and a pair of sneakers she'd later be asked to describe in detail. That same evening, right around 9 o'clock, someone matching his description was seen again, near the house itself. By 11, he was through the bathroom window. Mikio was the one who found him first, upstairs, away from his wife and children. What followed was a real struggle, violent enough that the intruder's own knife snapped in the fight, forcing him to grab a second blade from the kitchen to finish what he'd started. Yasuko and Nina were downstairs when it reached them. Ray, the youngest, died last and differently than the rest, by strangulation rather than the blade. In less than an hour, a house that had stood quiet and ordinary for a decade became a crime scene, and the person responsible didn't climb back out that window into the dark the way you'd expect. He stayed. For the next several hours, maybe as few as 2, maybe as many as 10, the man who had just killed 4 people made himself at home inside the house where their bodies lay. He went through drawers and papers, room by room, dumping what he didn't want into the bathtub, some of it torn apart with a pair of scissors he found in the house. Cash sat out in plain sight, and he barely touched it. He seemed to be searching for something else entirely, though nobody who has studied this case has ever been able to say what. He went to the kitchen and ate. Investigators would later count 4 servings of ice cream gone from the freezer, along with melon, and 4 bottles of barley tea, calmly consumed in a house where no one was left to stop him. He sat down at the family computer, opened a new folder, and browsed to a theater's website, apparently trying to look up ticket information, for reasons nobody has ever been able to explain. He used the family's toilet and didn't flush, leaving behind a detail so specific that forensic analysts could later determine exactly what he'd eaten the day before: sesame seeds and string beans, pulled straight from what he left behind. He'd been hurt in the fight with Mikio, badly enough that he needed to do something about it. So he found the family's first aid kit and treated his own wound right there, using supplies that belonged to people who could no longer object. He bled while he did it, onto towels, onto the computer keyboard and mouse he'd just used. By more than one account, he even lay down on the sofa upstairs at some point and slept. And when he was finally ready to go, he didn't leave the way he came. He changed. He took off his own clothes, a rare white and purple shirt of which only 130 had ever been sold in the entire country, a jacket, a scarf, gloves, a hat, 2 handkerchiefs, faintly scented with cologne, and folded them neatly on the sofa, like a guest tidying up before checking out. In their place, he put on some of Mikio's own clothes and walked out of that house sometime before dawn on December 31st, vanishing into a neighborhood that was just beginning to wake up. He left his knife behind. He left his bag with its strange sand from 2 different corners of the earth. He left almost 250,000 yen in cash sitting untouched, even though some of the money Yasuko earned tutoring was reportedly missing. He left more physical evidence in that one house than almost any crime scene in Japanese history has ever produced. And somehow, none of it was ever enough to tell anyone who he was. Which brings us back to that morning, December 31st, not long before 11. A grandmother walking through a front door that had been left open all night. She's the one who finds it, all of it, in the space of a single walk through a house she must have visited 1,000 times before. Her daughter, her son-in-law, her 2 grandchildren, one of whom had been standing in her own living room the night before, safe, sleepy, completely unaware of the person already outside, already climbing. By the time she calls for help, the man responsible has been gone for less than an hour. He walked out of that house and into a neighborhood already stirring with the last morning of the year 2000. And nobody saw anything wrong at all. Whatever he looked like, walking down that quiet, half-emptied street in a dead man's clothes, carrying nothing but himself, it didn't raise a single alarm. What followed was, by any measure, one of the largest manhunts in Japanese history. More than 200,000 officers were assigned to the case at some point over the years that followed, adding up to hundreds of thousands of officer days. At the scene alone, investigators eventually cataloged more than 12,000 individual pieces of evidence. Fingerprints, blood, shoe prints, saliva, hair, and DNA. So much of it that detectives with decades on the job said they'd never worked anything close to it. From all of it, they built a remarkably specific portrait of a man they still couldn't name. Blood type A. Roughly 160 to 170 centimeters tall, thin build, possibly sandy or light-colored hair. DNA suggesting mixed heritage, an East Asian father and a mother of likely European descent, a profile unusual enough for the databases available at the time that some investigators believed it explained why no match ever came back. His shoes were a South Korean-made brand sold under a British label. His rare shirt was traced down to just 12 confirmed buyers out of the 130 ever sold, and every one of them was cleared. And that bag, the one with sand from 2 different places on Earth. Sand that matched a stretch of the Nevada desert near an American Air Force base in California, and also a specific skate park not far from the murder scene itself, has never been explained by any theory that's held up. Theories came anyway. One investigative journalist proposed a hired killer from South Korea, brought in over a land dispute, a claim police looked into and were never able to substantiate. Others pointed at the sand and wondered about a connection to the American military. A few, only half seriously, pointed back at Mikio's complaints about the skateboarders next door. None of it has ever closed the case. What the investigation did change was the law itself. In 2010, with the case still unsolved and the clock on Japan's old statute of limitations quietly ticking towards 0, the country abolished the statute of limitations entirely for crimes punishable by death, a shift driven in real part by the public's refusal to accept that this killer might simply outlast the calendar. And the picture is still moving. New DNA methylation testing in recent years has suggested the killer may actually have been in his 30s on the night of the murders, not the teenager or young man investigators once believed they were searching for, which means that somewhere in Japan, or somewhere far from it, there may be a man now in his 50s or 60s who has carried this for 25 years and said nothing. Today, the house in Kamaso Shigaya is mostly gone, though for years it stood exactly as it was, deteriorating quietly behind police tape, while people who loved the Miyazawas fought to keep it standing rather than let it be torn down. Small stone Jizo statue sits near the Sengawa River, not far from where the house once stood, placed there 100 days after the murders and still visited today. And every December, close to the anniversary, officers still walk the streets around Seijogakuin-mai Station, handing out flyers with a description that hasn't changed in 25 years, sometimes standing a mannequin dressed in a replica of the killer's own clothes, asking anyone at all if they remember a thin man, blood type A, mixed heritage, carrying a bag full of sand from 2 different corners of the world. In 2024, the number of new tips that came in was less than 200. 40 detectives are still assigned to this case, and only this case, full-time, a quarter century after a man climbed through a bathroom window and decided, for reasons only he will ever know, not to leave. He left his shoes, he left his knife, he left his blood on the computer mouse, and his eyes on a movie theater website nobody has ever explained. He left a shirt that only 12 people in the entire country ever bought. and a bag full of sand from a desert 7,000 miles from the room where he stood. He was seen more than once in the days before it happened by people who had no reason yet to remember his face. He left, in the end, almost everything a person could possibly leave behind, except his name. Sheshchit, the woman in the chair, on the evening of February 16, 2007, at about 7 p.m., a black SUV pulled into the parking lot of a small strip mall on Ventura Boulevard in a neighborhood of Los Angeles called Tarzana. And a young woman got out of the passenger side of this SUV, and she started walking across the parking lot toward a small hair salon called Esther's Haircutting Studio. And this woman had 2 bodyguards with her, and behind her, kind of at a distance, was this whole swarm of paparazzi with their cameras out, taking pictures of her walking. And she walked right up to the front door of the salon, and she pushed the door open, and she went inside. And the owner of this salon, a woman named Esther Tognazzi, who had been running Esther's haircutting studio for years, kind of looked up from what she was doing, and she recognized this young woman walking in the door. Because this young woman was actually one of the most famous singers on the entire planet. And Esther kind of walked over and she was like, "Hey, what's going on? What can I do for you?" And this young woman, who was 25 years old at the time, just sat down in one of the chairs in the salon, and she looked up at Esther and she said, "I want you to shave my head." And Esther kind of freezes and she's like, No, I'm not going to do that." And Esther later said in interviews that she assumed this young woman was going through some kind of hormonal moment, and she was going to regret it the next morning. And so Esther tried to talk her out of it. She said, "Listen, why don't we just wait? You have such beautiful long hair. Why don't you sleep on it?" But this young woman was not really interested in talking. And she just sat there staring at herself in the mirror. And so at some point, Esther kind of turned her back for a second, and this young woman reached over onto the counter, and she grabbed a pair of hair clippers, and she plugged them in, and she turned them on. And right there in the middle of Esther's salon, with the paparazzi outside snapping pictures through the window, this young woman just started shaving off all of her long brown hair. Big chunks of it fell onto the floor around her, and she just kept going until she had shaved every single hair off of her head. And when she was done, she reached into her purse, and she paid Esther $50 for the appointment. And she got up, and she walked out the back door of the salon, and she got back into the SUV, and she was gone. And within about 24 hours, the pictures of this young woman shaving her own head in a strip mall salon in Tarzana were on the cover of every single tabloid magazine in the world. But to really understand how this young woman had ended up bald and alone in a ransom salon in the San Fernando Valley on a Friday night in February of 2007, you have to go all the way back to 1981. In December of 1981, in a town called Macomb, Mississippi, a woman named Lynn, who was a school teacher, gave birth to a baby girl, and she and her husband, a man named Jamie, named the baby girl Brittany. And when Brittany was about 4 years old, the family moved from Mississippi to a really small town in Louisiana called Kentwood. And it was there in Kentwood, Louisiana, that Brittany basically grew up. And Brittany, from the time she was really little, was obsessed with singing and dancing and performing. Her mother, Lynn, would drive her all over the South to enter her in these little talent competitions. And by the time she was 8 years old, Brittany was auditioning for stuff in Atlanta and New York. And when she was 11 years old, in 1993, Brittany landed the biggest role of her young life. She got cast on a Disney Channel variety show called The Mickey Mouse Club, and she moved to Orlando, Florida to film the show. And this show is actually kind of famous because a bunch of the other kids in the cast at the time became huge stars of their own. Because on the same cast as Brittany was another 11-year-old singer named Christina Aguilera, and another 12-year-old singer named Justin Timberlake, and a kid actor from Canada named Ryan Gosling. So it was kind of an insane group of kids all together on the same show. And then when Brittany was about 15 years old, her manager at the time sent a demo tape of Brittany singing to a record label in New York called Jive Records. And the executives at Jive Records were completely blown away, and they offered Brittany a record deal on the spot. And then 2 years later, in the fall of 1998, Brittany's debut single came out. It was called Baby One More Time. And the music video for this song was this iconic music video where Brittany is dressed in a Catholic schoolgirl uniform, and she's dancing around a high school hallway. And that song and that music video basically launched Britney Spears into a level of fame that almost nobody in music history had ever seen before. She was 16 years old, and she was one of the biggest pop stars on earth. And over the next couple of years, Britney just kept releasing hit after hit after hit. Her albums sold hundreds of millions of copies. She went on huge world tours. She started dating her old Mickey Mouse Club castmate Justin Timberlake. And the two of them were basically the golden couple of pop music. And by the time she was 20 years old, Britney was worth well over $100 million. And pretty much everywhere she went on the planet, people basically treated her like royalty. But then in 2002, Britney and Justin Timberlake broke up. And after the breakup, Justin did a bunch of interviews where he basically told the world that Britney had cheated on him. And Justin actually released a music video where he had an actress who looked exactly like Britney playing the cheating girlfriend. And the entire tabloid media just piled onto Britney. She was cast as the villain in her own breakup. And Britney, who had basically been on the road performing since she was a little kid and had never really had a normal life, started to kind of unravel. In January of 2004, Britney flew to Las Vegas with her childhood friend Jason Alexander, and at like 5 in the morning, the two of them walked into a wedding chapel and got married. And then 55 hours later, Britney got the marriage annulled. Then later that same year, in September of 2004, Britney married a backup dancer named Kevin Federline. And in September of 2005, Britney and Kevin had their first son, and they named him Sean Preston. And then just a year later, in September of 2006, they had their second son, and they named him Jaden James. But then just 2 months after Jaden was born, in November of 2006, Britney filed for divorce from Kevin Federline. And what followed was a really ugly custody battle. And this brings us to the beginning of 2007. Britney was 25 years old. She had 2 babies. Her marriage had just fallen apart. She was in the middle of a public custody battle. And the paparazzi were literally following her every single day, everywhere she went, from the moment she woke up until the moment she went to sleep. And she was struggling. She had checked into and out of a rehab facility in the Caribbean just one day before the night at Esther's Salon. And on that day, February 16th, 2007, she had actually driven to Kevin Federline's house to try to see her 2 little boys. And Kevin had refused to let her see them. And it was after that Britney had told her driver to take her to the salon in Tarzana. And after Britney shaved her head that night, things basically kept getting worse. Because 5 days later, on February 21st, 2007, Britney was leaving a gas station in Los Angeles. And a paparazzi photographer walked right up to her car window, and Britney kind of snapped, and she grabbed a green umbrella out of the front seat of her car, and she just started smashing the paparazzi's SUV with the umbrella. And that video went viral all around the world. And then in January of 2008, Britney had a custody visit with her 2 sons. And at the end of the visit, when it was time to hand them back over to Kevin Federline, Britney refused, and she locked herself in a bathroom of her house with her son Jaden. And the police had to come, and there was this huge standoff, and eventually Britney was taken out of her house on a stretcher, and she was involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric hospital at UCLA on what is called a 5E150 hold, which is a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. And it was after this incident, on February 1st, 2008, that Britney's father, Jamie Spears, went to a court in Los Angeles, and he petitioned the court to be granted what is called a conservatorship over his daughter. And a conservatorship is basically a legal arrangement where somebody, in this case Jamie Spears, is given total control over another person's life, including their finances, their medical decisions, their relationships, basically everything. And these arrangements are typically used for elderly people who have dementia and cannot take care of themselves. But the court in Los Angeles decided that Britney, who was 26 years old at the time, was not able to take care of herself either. And so they granted the conservatorship to Jamie Spears. And it was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to just be for a few months until Britney got back on her feet. But that conservatorship would end up lasting for 13 years. And here is the strange part. Because during those 13 years, Britney Spears did not act like somebody who could not take care of herself. She released 4 more studio albums. She went on multiple world tours. She had a Las Vegas residency at Planet Hollywood that ran for 4 years and made over $130 million. She was a judge on a TV show called The X Factor. She basically kept working nonstop. And during those 13 years, Britney made hundreds of millions of dollars. But she was not allowed to spend that money the way she wanted to. She was not allowed to make her own medical decisions. She was not allowed to drive a car by herself. And according to her later testimony, she was not even allowed to remove her own birth control, meaning she was not allowed to have any more children. And for years, most people basically had no idea any of this was going on, because Britney was still up there performing on stage, and she looked like she was fine. But then, starting around 2019, a group of Britney's fans started to notice really strange patterns on her social media, and they started this movement online called East Free Britney, and they basically started demanding that the court release Britney from her conservatorship. And then on June 23rd, 2021, Britney Spears did something that she had not done in over 13 years. She spoke publicly. There was a hearing at a courthouse in Los Angeles about her conservatorship, and Britney called into that hearing over the phone. And in front of the judge, and in front of the entire world that was listening, Britney spoke for 23 straight minutes. And she basically told everybody the truth about what her life had been like for the last 13 years. She said that she had been forced to work when she did not want to work. She said that she had been forced to take medications she did not want to take. She said that she had a IUD birth control device inside of her body that she was not allowed to remove. She said that she had been forced into a mental health facility against her will. And she said, quote, "I just want my life back." And after that testimony, everything moved really quickly. 3 months later, on September 29th, 2021, the court suspended Jamie Spears as her conservator. And then on November 12th, 2021, the exact same court that had granted the conservatorship 13 years and 9 months earlier officially terminated it. And after almost 14 years, Britney Spears was finally free. And 2 years later, in October of 2023, Britney published a memoir about her life, and she called it The Woman in Me. And in that memoir, she wrote about the night she walked into Esther's haircutting studio in Tarzana and shaved her head. And she explained that everybody at the time had assumed she had just lost her mind. But she said, quote, "Nobody seemed to understand that I was simply out of my mind with grief. My children had been taken away from me." And she said that shaving her head that night was actually her way of pushing back against a world that had been staring at her and telling her what she should look like ever since she was a little girl in a Catholic schoolgirl uniform.